This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired.
Which one?
Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Week 4 edition of the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network, brought to you by the Fan Up Network. I am, as always, Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter at Jarvie the King. And we had a more normal week last week in Week 3 as opposed to Week 2 when we had all those injuries. But there were still some crazy things going on, and I think I have identified what's going on this season. And you see all these highly drafted players, and they're not performing up to standard. And that's what you all you have to do is take a look at the stats and then the stat leaders. And I'm just going down the line. The passing yard leaders in the league right now, Drew Brees is number 1, which that's normal. Then you got guys like Kirk Cousins, Matt Stafford, Matt Ryan, Jameis Winston. These are guys all in the top 10. You're not seeing guys like Cam Newton or Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers. Cam Newton, he's 12th on the list. Russell Wilson, he's 19th. Aaron Rodgers goes all the way down to number 23. That's not good for fantasy football players. Looking at the rushing yard leaders, you know who leads the league in yards right now? LeGarrette Blount. LeGarrette Blount is a guy you probably drafted somewhere in the 9th through the 15th round. And after him, Isaiah Crowell. That makes absolutely no sense. You have Ezekiel Elliott, Lamar Miller, and Devontae Freeman. Those are all guys who you expected to be. They were probably first-round picks, and they're in the top 10. But the rest of the top 10, it's just nobody's there. David Johnson right now, he's listed as 13th. Eddie Lacy, 14th. CJ Anderson, 15th. Todd Gurley sitting at number 19. Mark Ingram, 20th. It's the people that you drafted highly to be the backbone of your team. They're not performing. Go into the wide receivers. Marvin Jones is he has the most yards in the league right now, which, as a Detroit Lion fan, I'm extremely excited, but as a fantasy footballer, it makes absolutely no sense to me. After him, you got Stephon Diggs. Antonio Brown is 3rd, but then it's just, it was Antonio Brown, Odell Beckham, and Julio Jones. Julio Jones barely cracks the top 40, so that's really going to hurt fantasy football players. So the question has to be, do I try and trade these guys? Do I try and move on and get better players? Or do I stay the course and hope that at some point these players are able to right the ship? Now, I think you have to take this on a case-by-case basis. I think guys like Julio Jones, even though they were dealing with a nagging injury, Julio Jones is likely going to be able to turn this around. Whereas a guy like Todd Gurley, even though he had a 2-touchdown week last week, I think he's still going to have troubles the rest of the year because even though the Rams put up a lot of points last week, they had 2 touchdowns that weren't offense related. And Todd Gurley, both of his touchdowns were just 1-yard punch-ins, so you can't really count on him to get 1 or 2 of those a game. And even though he had 2 touchdowns, he still only had 87 yards on over 20 carries. His yards per carry average is under 4 right now, which it's not a good sign. I think Todd Gurley is still going to struggle. So that's a guy who you may want to try and move and try and get the maximum amount of return that you can out of somebody. But it's a case by case. I'm not telling you to go out there and trade away Aaron Rodgers for little to nothing or Todd Gurley for little to nothing. Try to get as much as possible out of these guys because you're trying to salvage your fantasy season right now, and you're going to have to make that decision really quick. So before I get to breaking down the matchups in Week 4, there are a couple bits of news that are applicable to us fantasy football players. Probably the biggest news to come out this week was Cleveland Browns' Josh Gordon says that he's going to be entering rehab, that it's the right decision for him, and it's all the best for him, and I hope he's able to figure out whatever issues are going on with him. But for anybody who drafted him in the hopes that he was going to be productive this season, you're going to have to put that all on the back burner now. And we're already in week 4. He would have been coming back next week, week 5. But right now, it's really murky. It's quite possible that the Browns may just move on from Josh Gordon altogether. They're going to help him out as much as they can, but I don't see the Cleveland Browns really trusting him at this point. So for all you Josh Gordon owners right now, you may want to drop him because you're probably not going to see him for another couple weeks. If there is somebody out there on the waiver wire, I would definitely go for somebody who's going to contribute to your team right now. Another piece of news is that out of the Buffalo, there's major concern for wide receiver Sammy Watkins and his availability going forward. He was out last week against the Cardinals, and it really isn't looking too good for this week. And they're just saying that there's more going on. And even Rex Ryan said that he, in quotation marks, said that there's major concern about his availability. So you're going to want to try and replace Sammy Watkins if you were relying on him this season. A good piece of news is that in Houston, the Texans head coach Bill O'Brien is going to be taking over the offensive play calling duty from the offensive coordinator, which I'm not sure if any of you watched the game that I watched last week with Houston against New England, but that play calling was just awful. They seem to be running Lamar Miller into the ground. They aren't using DeAndre Hopkins and Will Fuller enough. They have Braxton Miller. They have Jalen Strong. They have weapons. They're just not using them properly. So I think this could be a really good thing, that if Bill O'Brien can call a better game than George Godsey, then you got to have a little bit more hope. The Texans are still probably going to have some kinks to work out with Bill O'Brien taking over the reins as the main play caller, but I think this is a good thing for the Houston Texans. And last bit of news about wide receiver Dez Bryant. He had the injury in the game last Sunday, and I know watching the game, my wife had him, and she was like, "Come on, the first play of the game, he was able to come back, and he wasn't that productive." But I think he knew that something was wrong, and they're saying right now he has a fracture in his right leg, or in his right knee, and we're getting mixed signals again from Jason Garrett and from team doctors and from experts. Jason Garrett earlier in the week was saying that he wasn't going to rule Dez Bryant out, which we've seen him do this before with Tony Romo, saying, I'm not going to rule Tony Romo out for the beginning of the season, where he has a fracture in his spine and he's out for the majority of the first half of the season. Dez Bryant more than likely going to miss a couple weeks at least with this fracture. He's going to need probably 4 to 6 weeks if I had to guess. But so if you're a Dez Bryant owner, Cole Beasley might get an uptick in value. He might get some more targets. Terrence Williams as well. But I think this also is going to help Ezekiel Elliott. They're going to lean on him a little bit more. He had a pretty decent game in week 3. And I think you'll probably see him get more carries, more receptions. But Dez Bryant probably going to be out of action for a couple weeks here. But let's move on to the matchups this week that I think are going to impact you the most in fantasy football. And we'll start out with an AFC South matchup, the Indianapolis Colts at the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think the Colts, even though they won last week, I think they're going to struggle going into Jacksonville. I think Andrew Luck still having a tough time, coming back from the injury from last year, and he just really hasn't been himself. So I think Andrew Luck might struggle this week, but you're more than likely going to start him this week. Frank Gore, though, again, he's right in the middle. I think he's a low-end running back, too. And then T.Y. Hilton at wide receiver. Last week, really got helped out in the fourth quarter with a long 63-yard touchdown. And you're going to start him, but he is becoming more and more reliant on those really long touchdowns. He's not going to get you he's not going to catch the ball like 12 times like an AJ Green, like an Antonio Brown. T.Y. Hilton is going to give you 7 receptions and hopefully 110 yards with a long touchdown. So I'd be very wary of T.Y. Hilton this week. And then Philip Dorsett, he didn't do as well as I hoped that he did last week. And I think you might see more of him this week and going forward. I think Andrew Luck, as he goes through the year, he's going to get more used to Philip Dorsett. So I'd be on the lookout for him. On the other side, with the Jacksonville Jaguars, Blake Bortles, he's really hard to pin down right now. Sometimes he has a good week, sometimes he has a really, really bad week. And this might be a week if they do get down in the game at some point, then Bortles will have to raise his game up. So that might be to your advantage as a fantasy owner, but I don't really advise starting him at this point, because I think at best you can expect somewhere between 250 and 300 yards and about 2 touchdowns. That's probably the average Blake Bortles game that you're going to get. The running back situation is a big issue. TJ Yeldon, and with Chris Ivory back, it's a split time now. So TJ Yeldon, I still think his main value is in PPR leagues, and then I think Chris Ivory on the other side has more value in a standard league. He's going to be more of the every down runner, where TJ Yeldon is going to be the pass catching threat on third downs. Now, the wide receiver situation, we talked about Allen Robinson, Allen Hurns both being a big combo, and I definitely had my reservations about Allen Hurns coming in this year. He got his big money deal, and a lot of times you get that FU money, and then you don't really have to do a whole lot, and it's kind of shown so far. Allen Robinson, he's the only guy in the wide receiver core that I actually feel comfortable about starting. He's going to get enough targets that he's going to produce. He's going to get yards, he's going to get receptions, and he's going to get some touchdowns. Allen Hurns, I'm just not sure if he's going to get that week in, week out. So I think he's a low-end flex play at best, but if I have a better option, I'm probably going to put him in over Allen Hurns. And Julius Thomas is coming back into his own. I really think he's going to be, by the end of the season, he's going to be the second option for Blake Bortles. It's going to be Allen Robinson and then Julius Thomas. And Allen Hurns, he'll have a game here and there, but it's going to be more between those two guys. The next matchup I have listed, I have the Cleveland Browns, amazingly, and the Washington Redskins. Cleveland last week kind of came out of nowhere, and the big story there was Terrell Pryor. He was your everyman. He lined up at quarterback, at running back, at wide receiver, and he was able to do everything. Now, the quarterback who took the majority of the snaps was rookie Cody Kessler, and he's not a starter for fantasy football. He's a starter in the NFL by chance, but he's not going to do enough for you fantasy wise that you're gonna ever start him unless you're in a really, really deep 2-quarterback league. Cody Kessler is going to remain on the waiver wire the entire year. And then Isaiah Crowell, I mentioned it earlier. He's one of the leaders in rushing yards right now, and I'm not sure how long that's going to last, because they also have Duke Johnson on their team. And while similar to the Jaguars, I think Crowell has more value in a standard league, Duke Johnson more in a PPR. You're not going to start them both ever. If you happen to have both of these guys on your team, you should really look at getting rid of one of those guys. But Isaiah Crowell, I think he's right now, because he's getting the yards, I think he's a low-end running back too. And you should start him until he really kind of drops off the face of the earth. Duke Johnson, I'd probably sit him in the majority of leagues. Maybe in a PPR situation, I put him in at flex. But Duke Johnson really taking a back seat at this moment. And the star of the team really is Terrell Pryor. He was looked at as probably the third wide receiver on the team going into the year. And I talked about him. I said Terrell Pryor is going to be an interesting player this year, with Josh Gordon being out for the first 4 games. And now Josh Gordon out pretty much indefinitely. You got Corey Coleman with a broken hand. Terrell Pryor really gets a chance to shine. So I think Terrell Pryor is going to be a good start this week. I think you should start him going forward, at least in a flex position, because, and you saw what he was able to do last week. I think he could continue this pace. He could really be at least a top 15 wide receiver. And then I think Gary Barnidge, he's really dropping for me. Last year he had the breakout season. He had Josh McCown throwing to him. I think with Cody Kessler now, it's gonna be tough for him to really try and reproduce the success that he had last year. So if you have a better option, you might want to look at getting rid of Gary Barnidge. You're just gonna have to bite the bullet on that one. He was really looked at as probably a top 5, top 7 tight end, and it just really isn't working out for him now. On the other side of the ball, I think the Redskins are going to have a good matchup this week. I think Kirk Cousins is a really good start going up against the Browns. He's really thrown a ton. He's had some mistakes, but I think Kirk Cousins is a good start this week. The running back situation, Matt Jones, I have him at best. I think he's a flex start. I think there's other guys right now who are performing better than Matt Jones that would be a better start. So if I don't have to, I don't want to start Matt Jones, but I think he's good enough to be a flex play this week. And then Deshaun Jackson, if he does play, I think he's playing right now. He's the number 1 guy, and he's good enough to be a wide receiver too. So Deshaun Jackson should probably be started in most leagues. And then after him, I think Jamison Crowder is the next best wide receiver on that team. Pierre Garçon has not been doing as much, and he hasn't done anything this year. And then Josh Doxson, I think he's still dealing with injuries. He hasn't showed up at all. So Jamison Crowder really is the number 2 wide receiver on this team, and he's been getting consistent targets, and he's been the one who's been getting the touchdown. So I think Jamison Crowder, you should really consider starting him in flexes in the majority of leagues. Unless you have somebody who's clearly better than Jamison Crowder, then I would put him in your starting lineup. And then Jordan Reed, he's a guy you're going to have to start. You drafted him to be that number 1 tight end. I still think he can turn it around. So put him in your lineup and just hope and pray that he does perform. Going on to the Seattle Seahawks at the New York Jets. Russell Wilson, he's dealing with injuries in both of his legs now. He has the right sprained ankle, and now he has a sprained MCL in his left leg. But he's been participating in all the practices, and for all intents and purposes, he's probably going to start on Sunday up against the Jets. And I think he's going to struggle because the Jets have a really good pass rush. And even though Darrelle Revis hasn't looked like the Darrelle Revis that we've known and loved for years and years, he's still going to struggle. Without that mobility and him being able to get away from the pass rush, Russell Wilson probably going to struggle this week. But you drafted him to be your starter. Unless you have a better option, I would probably still stick with Russell Wilson on the off chance that he does have a big game and that he's able to sling the ball around, maybe get 300 yards and a couple touchdowns. Going to the running back situation in Seattle, Christian Michael clearly has a stranglehold on this position. Until Thomas Rawls gets fully healthy, Christian Michael, you should probably be starting him. It's not the best matchup against the Jets, so I wouldn't be surprised if he has a down day. But Christian Michael has done enough to really be started in most leagues, at least as a running back 2, at worst a flex. I think you're putting him in most weeks. For the wide receiver situation, Doug Baldwin is really the only guy that I want to start because he's the main wide receiver who Russell Wilson is going to always try and feed the ball to. So he's going to get enough targets, enough receptions, and you just hope that he gets a touchdown to bring his day up. But everybody else, Jermaine Kearse, he hasn't been doing enough to really be started in fantasy football. And Tyler Lockett has been getting a few more looks, and I would feel you're going to have to watch and see if he actually plays. But Tyler Lockett, I'd still probably sit him on the bench this week. And then Jimmy Graham, he is questionable, but if he does play, I think you have to play Jimmy Graham because he really is showing signs of becoming what they thought he was going to be before he got injured last season. So you're starting Jimmy Graham. On the other side of the ball, you have the New York Jets, who had a horrible week last week. And you got to start with the quarterback, Ryan Fitzpatrick, with 6 interceptions. And the only thing you can go is that you can't get any worse. I don't think he could go out and throw 7 interceptions. But it was just an all-around bad day for the offense. Ryan Fitzpatrick, this is a bad matchup. Even if this was Aaron Rodgers or Cam Newton, this is a bad matchup against the Seahawks defense. And especially so for Ryan Fitzpatrick, he's not a good start this week. So I would leave him on your bench. And even if he goes out and gets 3 touchdowns, I'd feel better starting somebody else and not try and reproduce that 6 interception day. So leave him on your bench. Matt Forte, though, he's still a pretty good starter. Likely going to have a down day going up against Seattle. But Forte, at least he's as good as a running back, too. Brandon Marshall should play. Eric Decker, he's questionable. There's talk that he's might get an MRI, but they're uncertain with him. And Quincy Enunwa, all the wide receivers, even regardless who starts, they're all going to have tough matchups. I guess if I had to start one, I'd probably go with Quincy Enunwa just because he is probably the healthiest out of the 3. Eric Decker might not even play. And Brandon Marshall more than likely going to be going up against Richard Sherman all day. So I would probably go with that slot guy and Quincy Enunwa. If anyone's going to have any success, I would probably pick him. But I think the Jets, more than likely, outside of Matt Forte, are going to have a tough time this week. Going on to the AFC and AFC East matchup, you got the Buffalo Bills at the New England Patriots. The Bills, I think Tyrod Taylor is in for a tough day. The Patriots they're known for their offense, but I think that narrative is slowly moving to them having a very, very dependable defense, which it's really surprising. It's surprising me, and I think it's surprising a lot of people at how well this defense is doing. They shut out the Houston Texans last week, who have a ton of weapons: Lamar Miller, DeAndre Hopkins, Will Fuller, and I think the Bills, it's not like they have a ton more talent than the Texans, so I think the Bills are definitely going to struggle in this matchup on Sunday. Tyrod Taylor, I would definitely leave him on the bench. He's not going to do much for you. I think LaShawn McCoy, you finally got some touchdowns out of him last week, but we've seen what the Patriots have done against the run, and for lack of better words, they've shut it down. So LaShawn McCoy, probably going to have a tough day. He might get a touchdown, but I don't see him getting a ton of yards in this game. It's going to be a knockdown slugfest for them. And as I mentioned before, I think Sammy Watkins, very questionable to play. You're probably not going to see him again, and maybe not for a couple weeks. And the number 1 wide receiver after him, Robert Woods, I would just take the Buffalo Bills and put them all on the shelf this week. And then going on over to the New England Patriots, you got Jimmy Garoppolo dealing with his AC joint. He was limited in practice this week. You have Jacoby Brissett dealing with a thumb injury. He's limited in practice this week. So you have both of those guys who you're not sure who's going to play. And who's the backup quarterback after that? It's none other than wide receiver Julian Edelman. So I, for one, would love to see Edelman suit up for this game and be the quarterback. And then I want to see the Patriots win with 3 different quarterbacks in weeks 1 through 4 without Tom Brady. That would be the biggest FU that the Patriots could give to the NFL for this whole rigmarole with Deflategate. But more than likely, one of those guys is going to suit up. Jimmy Garoppolo, Jacoby Brissett. But I wouldn't expect much out of either of those guys, regardless who plays. So that's going to lead to another heavy dosage of LeGarrette Blount. I think he's another good play this week. I would definitely have him in your starting lineup. And you're probably going to get at least close to 100 yards and a touchdown, maybe 2. And then the only wide receiver I would start on this team would be Julian Edelman, because maybe you get a couple quarterback points, maybe you get some passing yards and a passing touchdown, maybe you get a receiving touchdown. But the Chris Hogans, the Malcolm Mitchells, they're not going to do enough consistently to really start them for fantasy football. And then the Rob Gronkowski situation, last week he was active for the game, only played 16 snaps, was targeted once. It's a tough situation when you're dealing with Rob Gronkowski. I think they're going to have him involved more, but you just don't know. They're going to work him back slowly, and they're probably going to want him for when Tom Brady's there. So you may have another down week, but you're risking the possibility that maybe Gronk goes out, has 2 catches, gets 2 touchdowns. So if he was on my team, I'd probably start Rob Gronkowski and expect the worst, that he doesn't really do a ton, but hope for the best that he does go out there and just kills it fantasy-wise. So going on to the next matchup, we got the Carolina Panthers at the Atlanta Falcons. The Panthers had a rough day last week against the Minnesota Vikings, and I think you're going to see across the board a better day for all of their offense. I think Cam Newton had 3 interceptions. He did have the 1 rushing touchdown, but you're going to see him have a much better day, and you actually could see him, with that poor performance last week, he could go out this week and just absolutely destroy Atlanta. I wouldn't be surprised, but I think Cam Newton is definitely a starter. He's going to do good this week. Cameron Artis-Payne, I have him as a low-end flex. I don't think he's going to do a ton, but just because he's the starter and this is a better matchup than last week, he's not going up against the Vikings' great defense. I think he's going to have a better day. I have him as a low-end flex right now. Kelvin Benjamin, he's definitely going to have a better day. He was awful last week, and people were questioning, is he really back? Yes, Kelvin Benjamin is going to have another better day. With Cam Newton have a better day, Kelvin Benjamin's going to have a better day. And then Greg Olsen also. The dudes, regardless, the Greg Olsen just seems to get it done. So you put him in your starting lineup and feel happy and safe and warm about that. On the other side, Matt Ryan has been having a pretty good season so far, but he's had very favorable matchups. So he really gets his first test going up against the Carolina Panthers, who have a pretty solid defense. I think he may have a rude awakening waiting for him this week. Going to the running backs, Devontae Freeman, Tevin Coleman, both of them have been performing pretty well. And I think Devontae Freeman, you're still going to start him as a running back 1 or running back 2, but Tevin Coleman definitely, he deserves to be in consideration to be a flex in most leagues. I think he has a little bit more value in PPR, but he's been getting touchdowns, so it's hard not to put him in your lineup. So I think both of those guys, if you have both of them on your team, I have a hard time starting 2 running backs from the same team. But definitely, if you have, both of these guys should be started in the majority of leagues. Julio Jones only had 1 catch yet last week. I think he definitely has a bounce back. Even if Matt Ryan has a bad day this week, I think Julio Jones will come back. He'll probably get somewhere 80 to 100 yards, and hopefully he gets a touchdown, even if the Falcons struggle against the Panthers defense. And then Mohamed Sanu, I'd put him as a low-end flex option this week. He has dropped off a little bit, and I think going up against this Panthers D, he could struggle this week. And then the tight end, Jacob Tamme, he's a maybe for me. There's a lot of sleeper tight ends that I like, and Jacob Tamme is right on the border. And he could be the guy if they get down to the red zone. He's that option that they go to if Julio Jones and Sanu are covered. Jacob Tamme could sneak away with a touchdown. I'm going to take a quick break real quick. When we come back, I'll wrap up the rest of the mashups I outlined, and then I'll give you my starts and sits of the week. You're listening to the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
The Fantasy Nerd Show is sponsored by the Fan Up Network. They've developed the ultimate fantasy football app. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need. You can track teams and scores across multiple platforms, Get latest injury and player news and access to expert advice. See the hot trends with waiver pickups and drops. It has everything you need to manage all your fantasy football teams. Android users can get the app in the Play Store, and an iPhone version is now available in the App Store. Go to fanupnetwork.com to learn more and follow them on Twitter at fanupnetwork.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Nerds. I'm about to wrap up the matchups, but I definitely want to thank you all for listening and supporting this show. You are the real reason why I do this every single week, because I want to help you guys do good in fantasy football, because even though it's a small thing, it is the small things in life that make it so much better to just keep going. So let's wrap up these week 4 matchups. You got the Denver Broncos at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think Trevor Siemian is a really big sleeper this week. And it may be, he had a big game last week. He had the 4 touchdowns, but I definitely have him as a sleeper. I think going up against the Bucs, I think he had his coming out party last week, and I think it's just going to continue. I like him this week. I tried to get him in a couple of my leagues to replace. I had Russell Wilson. I was hoping maybe I could get Trevor Siemian, but I lost out, unfortunately, but I think he could have a big week this week. CJ Anderson definitely struggled last week as Trevor Siemian succeeded, but I think CJ Anderson he'll likely level out. I think he's still going to be he's a starter. You're going to put him in every week. And then Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders, both of these guys should be started. And this is a situation where if I actually had both of these guys on my team, I'd consider starting both of them, because both of them are getting enough targets, enough receptions to get points in fantasy football. And really, the guy who's been surprising me more is Emmanuel Sanders. I feel like people had written him off this year, but he has, I think, at least 9 more targets than Demaryius Thomas right now. But D. Thomas getting more yards, and I think it's going to even out. They're going to have similar numbers. So I would start both of those guys this week. Virgil Green, I'm kind of dropping off the face of the map because Siemian, his main targets right now, D. Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, and then it's going to be CJ Anderson. So Virgil Green, not really a factor in this offense right now. On the other side, with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Jameis Winston, I think even though he's been pretty solid, he had the 4 interceptions in the one game, but he has been a pretty decent quarterback so far. That Denver defense is going to put him on his back a couple times throughout the game, and I'd probably say more rather than less. So he could struggle in this game. Charles Sims, one of his first games as a full starter with Doug Martin out with injury, he actually was pretty solid. He didn't have a huge day, but running and receiving combined, he put up some pretty decent numbers, and I would probably have him as a low-end starter. I think he has a better chance to score more points in PPR leagues, but in standard or PPR, I would probably put him as a low-end running back too, and a really good flex option in most leagues. And then Mike Evans, he's really shown he's came into his own this year. He's been a top wide receiver so far, and unfortunately, I think he's going to struggle in this game. Going up against this really good Denver defense, I think Mike Evans, he'll probably still have a decent game because he's going to get enough targets, but I wouldn't be surprised if he struggled a bit. And then the other wide receiver on the team who I would keep on your radar is Adam Humphries. He's been getting a ton of looks, and he could be a guy, waiver wire acquisition. If you're looking for somebody to replace a wide receiver on your team, that's a name to keep in mind. And another name to keep in mind is Cameron Brate. They let go of Austin Seferian-Jenkins, and Cameron Brate, in his debut as the starting tight end, 2 touchdowns. Now, he's probably not going to get 2 touchdowns every single week, but it's somebody you should probably keep on your radar. With all these tight ends who haven't been performing up to snuff, Cameron Brate is a possibility to start in fantasy football this week at least. Out west, you got the LA Rams at the Arizona Cardinals. The Rams had a really good game last week, but don't be fooled. It's still a pretty bad offense. Case Keenum is still the quarterback, and you're not going to be starting him. He had the long touchdowns to Tavon Austin and Brian Quick, but he's not going to do that every single week. So you're not starting Case Keenum. And all those Todd Gurley owners had to feel they had to have a little sigh of relief when he got those 2 touchdowns last week. But you have to be reserved going forward. Both of those touchdowns were just 1-yard punch-ins. So is he going to get that every single week? I'm not sure. Todd Gurley really needs to make a name for himself. If he really is the best running back, he should be able to put this team on his back, and he hasn't done it yet. So until he really shows that he can, with 8 guys in the box, go out and get 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, I'm going to have my reservations on Todd Gurley. I'm still starting him every week, but you're going to have to lower your expectations on what he's going to give you. He only has he's only averaging 2.9 yards per carry at the moment. So that's not indicative of a really great running back in the NFL. So have your reservations about Todd Gurley. Tavon Austin and Brian Quick, they both pretty much got saved by the long touchdowns that they got. If you take those away, no receiver did good for the Los Angeles Rams. So the only one that I would even remotely think about starting would be Tavon Austin, just because of how athletic he is. Of the wide receivers, Tavon Austin is the guy who's more than likely going to get the touchdown week in and week out. On the other side of the ball, Carson Palmer should not be as bad as he was last week. He struggled, but I think going up against the LA Rams is going to be the medicine that he needs. He might still struggle with the pass rush that's going to be coming after him with Aaron Donald, but I think Carson Palmer should have a bounce back week. I have him as a borderline starter. I'm not at that point where I'm like, yeah, definitely start Carson Palmer, but I'm also not, you got to bench him at this point. So I think Carson Palmer, probably a starter this week, but have a little bit of reservations. David Johnson, still a starter. He's been proving why a lot of the experts picked him as one of the top running backs, and he's been playing like it. I think I'm probably going to have to eat my words at the end of the season, because David Johnson is going to be a pretty good running back in this NFL, at least for this season, maybe for longer. And then the wide receivers for the Cardinals, Larry Fitzgerald, still the number 1 guy. He's the guy who's getting the majority of the targets. And then after him, you got Michael Floyd, but he is coming off of a concussion. So he was cleared to practice. He apparently went through all the protocol, but I do have some reservations about him going into this week against the Rams. And then you got to be happy. You saw John Brown get more involved last week, and if Michael Floyd does take plays off, John Brown, I would probably put him as a sleeper wide receiver. I'm not sure if he's going to get the touchdown, but he could be seeing more targets this week, which could lead to more yards and the possibility of touchdowns. But more than likely, the only guy that I really feel comfortable starting is Larry Fitzgerald. Going over to the New Orleans Saints at the San Diego Chargers, Drew Brees is still Drew Brees. That guy is older than dirt at the moment, but he's throwing the ball around like a young Drew Brees. So Drew Brees, still a good starter, a really good matchup against these San Diego Chargers. He's going to have a good week. And then I think Mark Ingram, after a slow start in the first couple games, he's really looking to start revving up. And I think Mark Ingram could be due for having a big day going up against these San Diego Chargers. Brandon Cooks had a pretty poor week last week, but he's going to be fine. I think he's going to get his targets and he'll get his catches. Brandon Cooks, it's really hard to sit a guy like that because he's the number 1 starter. So Brandon Cooks, definitely start him this week. Willie Snead is still questionable, and that's somebody who you're going to have to monitor going into Sunday morning. And just hope that he plays, or that you get an early designation that he's out, because the guys behind him were pretty serviceable. Brandon Coleman and Michael Thomas both had pretty decent games, I think both of them really could be sleeper flex plays. If Drew Brees throws the ball around like he did last week, both of them could really see numbers. And so if I had to pick one, I'd probably give it to Michael Thomas just because he's the rookie. I think he could be getting those touchdowns a little bit earlier than Brandon Coleman because they're going to have to get Brandon Cooks in the mix. So I would probably go Brandon Cooks and then Michael Thomas and Brandon Coleman after that. And that is if Willie Snead is out this week. Even if Snead is out, they may just work him back a little bit slowly. And then Kobe Fleener really he seems to be coming into his own. Every week he seems to be getting a little bit better. And that's a really good sign for the Kobe Fleener owners who drafted him higher and hoped that he could be that next Jimmy Graham. And it really is looking like he could be that answer. So I'm starting him now. I'm back on the Fleener train. Going over to the San Diego Chargers, Phillip Rivers, he's been okay this season. He hasn't had any turnovers, but he needs to get touchdowns. That's where you get the majority of the points for your quarterback. So until he is consistently putting up 2 or 3 touchdowns, I might leave him on my bench. But I think this is a good matchup this week. Going up against the Saints. Saints are giving up a ton of points. I said earlier that the Saints and the Giants could be a shootout, and I was wrong on that one. But I'm gonna say it again. This could be another one where it's going to be a shootout, where you got Brees and Rivers going back and forth. So take that information. I'd be careful starting Phillip Rivers this week. Melvin Gordon has proven he's a pretty solid running back too. With no Danny Woodhead, he had a tough matchup last week, but I think going up against the Saints, I think Gordon is probably going to have another good day. So start him going forward. Travis Benjamin and Tyrell Williams, to me, both of these are sleeper wide receivers. I think Travis Benjamin probably should be looked at as a wide receiver too, just because he really is the number one receiving option on the team. And I think Tyrell Williams has done enough and he's good enough to be a flex play. So both of these guys should probably be started in the majority of the leagues. And then another sleeper tight end, Hunter Henry, starting to come on, a rookie tight end. I like him in this game. He could be in the mix to get a touchdown, which will definitely help people in fantasy football. Going on to Sunday Night Football, you got the Kansas City Chiefs at the Pittsburgh Steelers. Alex Smith, he had the big game week 1 against the Chargers, and I think people got a little overinflated. I count myself in those people. Alex Smith, he really, truly is a game manager. You're not going to see those 360-yard games every week. So I think this game, he's going to be another game manager, but he's not good enough to start in fantasy football. And then the guy that people have been waiting to come back for forever right now, Jamal Charles, likely to make his debut this week against the Steelers. But even if he does start, he's likely going to be splitting time with Spencer Ware, which all that does is hurt Charles and Ware owners because it's going to eat into both of their production. Unless Jamal Charles comes out and is just completely 100% and rips off an 80-yard touchdown, you're likely going to see a 50-50 split between these guys. And I'm not sure if I feel comfortable starting either of these guys. If I have better options on my teams, I'd probably start them over Charles and Ware just because I think it's going to be so split between them. You're not going to get a ton of points out of them. Jeremy Maclin, I think he's a low-end wide receiver starter. He's the guy who's going to get the majority of the targets. It's going to give you points, and hopefully you get a touchdown, and that's what you're going to be hoping out of Jeremy Maclin. And then Travis Kelce, he's one of those tight ends you start week in, week out. After Jeremy Maclin, Alex Smith is likely going to be looking at Travis Kelce, so he is a good start. On the other side of the ball, Big Ben had a bad week last week. I went up against the Philadelphia Eagles. He should bounce back, and he's definitely going to be helped by getting his number one running back, returning this week in Le'Veon Bell. So Le'Veon Bell should be the starter, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see D'Angelo Williams play a little bit this game. And I actually could predict that D'Angelo Williams might steal a touchdown from Le'Veon Bell. So be careful starting Le'Veon Bell and D'Angelo Williams. But I think both of them, Le'Veon Bell, I'd probably start. D'Angelo Williams, if you have nobody else, then you might want to play him at the flex because he might just give you that touchdown and help you win the game. Antonio Brown, he's playing like Antonio Brown. You're still going to play him every week. And then Marcus Wheaton got the chance last week, and he just absolutely failed. So I'm off the Marcus Wheaton train. Sammy Coates and Eli Rogers, those are the guys that you need to keep on your radar. So you got Antonio Brown, who's going to get probably 12 to 15 targets a game. And then Coates and Rogers are going to get the majority, the rest of those other targets. And they're good enough to get you yards, get you touchdowns. I'm not starting them this week, but you got to keep him on your radar. And then the tight end, Jesse James, I think he's still a top 10 tight end at the moment. You got to wait and see if Ladarius Green is ever going to come back from his injury. But James, I think in that offense, could still score some points through yards and through touchdowns. And that brings us to our final matchup of the week, the Monday Night Football Showdown, the New York Football Giants at the Minnesota Vikings. Starting with the Giants, I think Eli Manning has had a pretty decent year, but he's going to struggle this week. You saw Cam Newton struggle against the Vikings. He was sacked 8 times last week, and Cam Newton is a mobile quarterback. Eli Manning is the farthest thing from a mobile quarterback. So Eli could be in some trouble this week. I think he's going to struggle. I would probably not start him this week if I had a better option. Rashad Jennings, the running back, he's likely to miss again. And then the guy who replaced him last week had a pretty good game, Shane Vereen, they just put him on IR for, I think, a torn pec. So he's out for the year. And the running back job falls on the likes of Orleans Darkwa. And that's a guy who I would put on my radar, but I think he's a bad play going up against the Vikings. You saw Cameron Artis-Payne wasn't able to do much against the Vikings last week. I don't think Orleans Darkwa is good enough right now to be able to break through that Minnesota defense. So he's not going to do a ton. The wide receivers have been the most surprising part of this team so far. Odell Beckham Jr. has been good enough. He's proven that he's one of the best receivers in the league, so you're going to start him. But I think the rookie wide receiver, Sterling Shepard, has really shown and proven that he should be started in fantasy football. I think you should put him in your flex play and feel comfortable, because after OBJ, Eli is looking at Sterling Shepard, so he's going to get you points. And I'd feel comfortable starting him in this Monday Night Football matchup. Victor Cruz, I'm a little bit worse on. I'm not sure. He's still in the mix, but he isn't scoring consistently enough that I want to start him for fantasy football. On the other side, you got the Minnesota Vikings, who they look really good, but they look good defensively. And it's not sexy for fantasy football. Sam Bradford, thank God he came to the Vikings, because they would have been a mess with Sean Hill for this season. But Sam Bradford, just like Alex Smith, he's a game manager. He's not going to give you a ton of points. So I'm not going to start him in this game. And then Jerick McKinnon, he had the tough start against Carolina last week. I think he's got another tough week ahead going up against the New York Giants. So if I had somebody else, I would probably start him over Jerick McKinnon. And then the receiver option, Stephon Diggs has been a nice story, and I think he's this week a strong flex option. But it's really just because he's going to get the majority of those targets, and you hope that he breaks a long touchdown. That wraps up the breakdowns for this week, and it's about wraps up this episode. But I can't finish the episode without getting you my starts and sits for week 4. So last week I boasted about going 6-0 in week 2, and I promptly went 3-3 in week 3. It was tight. I gave you some decent starts. I gave you Dak Prescott. He had a pretty solid day, but Jerick McKinnon and Philip Dorsett did not do very well. And then Cam Newton I told you to sit him. He had a bad game. I told you to sit C.J. Anderson. He had a bad game. And Odell Beckham, I told you to sit him. And he still got 7 receptions and 121 yards. He didn't get a touchdown. He got robbed of a touchdown, actually. I still counted that as a loss because he still had 7 and 121. But I'm going to look to rebound in week 4 and give you some better matchups. So starting with the quarterback, my start, I told you about him. Trevor Siemian going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think he's going to continue his ways from last week. I think he's going to have another big week, at least 300 yards, hopefully 2 to 3 touchdowns. And on the sit side for quarterback, I'm sitting Andrew Luck. That Jacksonville defense is a little bit scarier than people are giving him credit for. And Andrew Luck, with his sore shoulder, I think he's going to have another setback in this week. So that's why I have him on my sit list. For running backs, my start, I got Jordan Howard of the Chicago Bears going up against the Detroit Lions. I didn't detail this game, but Jordan Howard taking over the starting roles for Jeremy Langford, going up against the depleted Detroit Lions defense. I think it could be a scary day for him. I think he's going to at least get 100 yards and a touchdown. On the other side, for running backs at sit, I said he could have a good game, but I have him on my sit list for a good reason, and that is Le'Veon Bell, the Pittsburgh Steelers, going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. He's going up against a good defense. It's the first time he's played in almost a year, and I think he's going to struggle, and they're probably going to rely on D'Angelo Williams to help him out in this game, and Big Ben's also going to throw the ball around. So that's why I think Le'Veon Bell is going to struggle this week, and I have him on my sit. My start for the wide receiver, again, I told you about him. Terrell Pryor, I think he had a good week last week, and he's really the only option outside of Isaiah Crowell in Cleveland. So Terrell Pryor, going to have a good week this week against the Washington Redskins. On the other side of the ball, at the sit, I think Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers going to have a tough go against Aqib Talib and Von Miller of that Denver defense. Mike Evans has had a really good year this far, but I wouldn't be surprised if he winds up with 2 or 3 catches for maybe 30 or 40 yards. So that wraps up my starts and sits of the week, and hopefully I do better this week. But that about wraps up this episode of the Fantasy Nerds. Big thanks to everyone for listening again. I am Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter at Jarvie the King. Ask me your fantasy questions. I'll get back to you on Sunday morning. But until next week, later, nerds.